Hello and welcome to Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton. I'm pleased to be to have a guest here today, Dr. Todd Belt from UH-Hilo. He's going to be talking about some of his research, his work, his teaching, particularly about a new book that he's got coming out about the U.S. presidency and foreign policy, sort of in a post-hegemonic age. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Todd Belt from UH-Hilo.
Thanks. It's great to be with you, Dr. Bratton.
This is the first time that you've been here on ThinkTech, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure. Pleasure always. So you've been in Hilo. I mean, what brought you to Hilo to teach out at UH-Hilo?
Well, I got a job.
That's always good. That's always good.
Yeah, coming out of graduate school, I had a couple of interviews, and Hilo is just the right place for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Where were you at before? Where were you?
I did my graduate work at the University of Southern California, USC.
Okay. And are you a SoCal person
I'm
originally?
from the Los Angeles area. Yeah, I grew up in a little place called Seal Beach, California.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were there seals there?
There were seals, and it was a good place to surf, so coming to Hawaii for a surfer was a good deal.
Okay, you're continuing to surf?
As often as I can, but, you know, been busy working too.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Interesting. So when did you come out to Hilo then?
Over 13 years ago.
Over 13 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Interesting. I mean, I'm always partial to Hilo. As I mentioned to you, my mom's family is from the Big Island,
Right.
so I get to go to sort of Hilo, Honoka, that sort of area a couple
It's a
times.
nice, quiet place. Yeah.
What was I mean, I have to ask this question. I mean, coming from Southern California to Hilo, I mean, what was the biggest sort of shock or surprise that you had?
Driving.
Driving.
No traffic, right? No traffic,
Okay, yeah.
and everybody drives a lot slower, and you just have to get into the slower Hawaiian style lifestyle. Yeah, just slow your whole world down. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the driving is a microcosm of that. Obviously, all other aspects of your life are like that too. Just slowing down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's funny. Once I remember I was staying with my family. I was living in D.C. at the time, and we had to go someplace, and I was budgeting like half an hour to drive. My dad's like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
It's going to take like 3 minutes to drive there. It's like, oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you're at UH-Hilo, and so you're teaching in the political science department.
Yes. I'm professor of political science at UH-Hilo. I teach classes in Intro to American Politics, research methodology, public administration, Congress and the presidency, and mass media and public opinion.
Okay, interesting. I mean, which one? I mean, when you're how many faculty are you in the program?
We have 5 faculty in the political science department at UH-Hilo. We also have another major that we service, which is our administration of justice major. So most of us do double duty that way.
Okay. And about how many students do you guys have?
We have, between both programs, it's close to about 200 students
Okay,
majors in political science and administration of justice. Administration of justice has about twice as many majors now as political science. Yeah.
What is this? Do you find that for students in Hilo, are they interested in particular things that are maybe different than your standard political science or criminal justice major, or?
I don't find too much difference of interest. I think that what really sets them apart is our students really tend to be really interested in finding solutions to problems and fixing problems that are out there. So I think that's the real difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you find the students want to do when they're done? Are they going into grad school, wanting to work local politics?
All kinds of stuff. I mean, I was just visiting a couple of my students over at the state capitol, and I have 4 of them working right now. You know, and a couple of them are grads, a couple of them are interns and stuff like that. So, you know, some of them want to go directly into politics. Some of them have gone into public affairs, public relations as well. Others have just gone into business. Many of our students have gone on to law school. We've had a really good track record of getting students into law school. Just had a student get into Harvard Law School recently.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Nothing.
So pretty good stuff. And a lot of students have gone on to graduate school as well. So we've had a pretty good record of preparing students for that type of stuff.
Okay, interesting, interesting. I mean, for you, like in the classroom, what's been one of your fondest memories or a really interesting teaching moment that you've had?
I don't know if it's, I mean, let me just give you, I got an email from a former student just the other day, and he was saying, I really miss your campaigns and elections classes because of what's going on right now.
Oh, sure.
With Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, and, you know, so many of the students are feeling the burn, as we call it, right? And so what really matters is, you know, when I hear back from them and I see that they're doing well and they're still interested and they still remember things, you know. Hilo's a small town. I run into them here and there. And so, I mean, you put me on the spot with trying to figure out one particular episode in class, but I think, what we really do it for is for the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always, I like it. There's really something, I don't know, a really nice feeling when a student contacts you from a couple of years and says, hey, something you did in class, I saw something in life or in work or whatever. Yeah, it really works. What you taught me really matters. I'm actually using it. How about that? You weren't just making all that up, right?
All that statistic stuff I actually use. What do you? Yeah, that's that's really reassuring. And rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you brought up political campaigns. You're teaching a class on campaigns. A couple of weeks ago, I had one of my colleagues on who was a political communications guy, and we were talking about whether or not this kind of interesting electoral campaign has changed rules, broken rules, or reinforced old rules. I mean, for you, is this something different, or is this the same? Or?
It's something we've never seen on the presidential level before. We don't have rules about how things work. The parties have rules about how they select delegates, which is another matter altogether. But in terms of the statistical models that we use to predict who will win elections, if you ran them before the primary started, you would have guessed that that Jeb Bush would be the Republican nominee, just running away with it. With the number of endorsements that he had. One of the things we look at is endorsements from other governors and senators, and he had a whole lot of those. Hillary Clinton as well. You would also predict that she would have locked up the nomination by now. And those things haven't happened. And obviously people would say that some of the things that Mr. Trump has said would not make him a viable candidate, and yet he still is. So a lot of the things that we're used to using for predicting winners and losers has really not worked out this time. It's a different media environment we're in. We're also living in a different world where people really communicate with people that share their same views instead of talking across the aisle so much. And I think that has a lot to do with explaining the world we have now.
Okay, interesting. I mean, have you having to change maybe how you teach classes, re-emphasizing this, or putting in new modules, or you're like, oh, that doesn't work anymore, we won't talk about that anymore? Or?
Saying I don't know a lot more than I used to. But I mean, it's they're interesting case studies. I mean, we've seen. In the past, we have seen occasionally a fringe candidate who brings up issues that Senator Sanders is bringing up now, but we've never seen someone have the type of success and mobilization that he has. I don't think we've ever seen anybody like Donald Trump before. So, but there are interesting ways to talk about what we do know and how things have worked in the past. Whether we can predict the future based on this election is another matter entirely.
Yeah. I mean, one narrative that often gets talked about is that, for both Trump and Sanders, although addressing different audiences, one of the things they seem to have figured out was that, we have these sort of voting blocks that were essentially taken for granted by both of the parties, and weren't feeling that their voice was heard or their interests were being catered to. Would you say that that's going to be a shift sort of permanently in sort of party politics and elections, that these different parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, will now try and focus on them, or will this be a blip and just...
Depends on whether or not they're successful. Right now, just because they're getting support now doesn't mean that's going to carry them all the way to the general election, although it does look like that's the case right now with Mr. Trump. I mean, you may remember Howard Dean, right? And he had the Deaniacs and all the people online, and a lot of that power did not translate over into electoral power, especially not in Iowa where he made his infamous scream. But a lot of the online enthusiasm, Bernie Sanders has been able to translate that into numbers and a few wins. Obama was really able to help get his younger enthusiastic supporters matched up with the older people who knew how to get people out to vote. So, clicking a thumbs up on Facebook is not the same thing as getting out and voting. It's not the same thing as going door to door and canvassing for a candidate. So I think the proof will be in the pudding, whether or not these candidates are successful. And obviously there are constituencies out there for people who are anti-establishment. So I think we will probably see more anti-establishment candidates in the future. But I think a lot of it has to do with, who dominates the narrative of the election. And to date, it's been Trump and to a lesser extent, Sanders' message, right? Even though Sanders has gotten much less broadcast media time, his message has had a real stamp on the election, with Hillary Clinton moving more towards his positions.
One thing that's interesting I always find is when you have this mixture of old and new. So on the one hand, you know, we give a lot of attention to social media and new ways of communicating, and you know, the internet's changed everything and all the stuff that we've had for the past 20 years. On the other hand, some traditional things of politics and campaigning matter. So one could argue, I mean, you know, Trump and then Sanders, you know, they have skills in retail politics that somebody like Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush seems not to do as well. And that's an old skill ever since somebody was, you know, I know back in Athens or back in wherever people were trying to do retail politics, kissing babies and shaking hands seems to still work, right?
Yeah, it does. And we can't say that the internet doesn't matter. It obviously does matter. We can't say that the old way of doing politics doesn't matter anymore, because it still holds weight. I mean, we're in a balance right now. I think both of them do matter. It's just, does a candidate have the right formula for translating that into political success? I think Obama did in 2008. I think Bernie Sanders is struggling a little bit with it. But then again, his message is a little bit more to the fringe than Obama's was in 08. So maybe he may have more of an uphill battle to do it, is what I'm saying. Also, you know, facing a well-entrenched person like Secretary Clinton's a very difficult proposition. He's gotten very, very far in his campaign, a lot further than most people would have imagined.
I know this is a difficult question to ask you. I mean, do you have any kind of thoughts or predictions about brokered conventions, or?
I don't even want to go there. I mean, this campaign, I mean, it has been, for those of us who study campaigns and elections, it's been a real slap across the face. I mean, everything we thought we knew, it's very difficult to make those sort of predictions. But we do know that after the first ballot, if nobody takes it on the first ballot, then those pledged delegates become unpledged, and anything could happen. So may we live in interesting times. Indeed we do.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll continue on with our conversation. We'll take a short break right now.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm fortunate to be able to host Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. I hope you'll join in with us every Tuesday from 12 noon to 1 p.m. to see the interesting people we have to share with you their information. Aloha.
Aloha, welcome to Think Tech Hawaii. My name is Josh Green. I'm the host of a program called Healthcare in Hawaii. I'm a physician. I work in the emergency department on the Big Island. I also serve in the state senate, which, please don't hold that against me, doesn't detract from my television program. We speak about all the big healthcare issues in the state. We get together on Tuesdays from 2 o'clock till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we try to talk about the most important issues in healthcare. This is a terrific venue for people to learn about healthcare. There are many programs on this station. We broadcast it later, not just on the internet, but also on OC16. Thanks for joining us. Please be informed healthcare consumers.
Hello and welcome back to Global Connections. We're talking with Todd Belt from Hilo. We're talking about the elections and other predictions. One of the things I wanted to maybe switch from the campaign, talking about some of the research that you've been doing. So you worked a lot on the presidency before publishing a book on U.S. domestic politics, and quite recently now a book, The Post-Heroic Presidency, Leverage Leadership in an Age of Limits, talking about presidential foreign policy. What do you, I have to ask the obvious question first, what do you mean by a post-heroic presidency?
Well, when we talk about the heroic presidency, we're talking about the type of leaders like Kennedy or FDR, who the president was almost like a Superman, could do anything, could lead from a position of strength, and could instill in the public a sense of optimism, a sense of greatness of the nation and the power of the nation, and lead us from that sort of position. Since the end of World War II, just to back up, the United States was the only country after World War II to emerge more powerful than when it went in. And for 25 years, we had what is a misnomer called the American century, right? From 1945 to about 1970. It
was a short century.
It was a short century, yeah, a quarter of a century. The U.S. quarter of a century is what it should be. But for 25 years, the United States was number one, big dog, right? And we could pretty much do just about anything we wanted. And we were the hegemon. And of course, Vietnam really broke that sort of that sort of idea, and every president except Nixon has had to deal with the fact that the United States has more commitments than it does resources to maintain those commitments. And so, there are some scholars who would say, every empire falls. Or Paul Kennedy is a scholar who says, the United States is in decline. We cannot maintain our commitments overseas. We can never lead like we used to. And then there are some people we call the revivalists, Joseph Nye and some others, who think that the United States just needs to reorganize its power, to reorganize the way that it leads, to use more soft power instead of hard power. So I'm using some lingo here. I'm happy to define it if that's important. And that the United States can be number one again. And this is just sort of a short-term blip. And so each president has had to deal with this, and they've dealt with it in different ways in terms of how they lead the nation, how they lead the country overseas, and how they practice statecraft.
Interesting. I mean, one of the things, this debate about decline, revivalism, and things.
Right.
It also gets mixed into another debate about introversion and extroversion. Thinking like channeling old Frank Klinkberg from the '50s here. I mean, it seems that whether the U.S. is in decline or not, we seem to be in this moment. I don't know, since about '06 or '08 of sort of introversion, where people seem to be less interested in the outside world. I mean, does that add an additional constraint, whether or not the power of the U.S. is declining, if the zeitgeist of the American people is inward-looking? Or is that a good thing, a bad thing in terms of the post-Rock presidency?
Well, it depends upon your perspective. Certainly, if you believe that the United States is overstretched, then it may be time to clean shop at home, right? And turning inwards can be a way for the United States to regain its domestic strength, so then it can then reassert itself internationally. So not necessarily a bad thing. But we do know that we go through waves of this, right? We have the Vietnam syndrome, or Vietnam hangover, as they used to call it, and then we had Reagan back in there, and then after Reagan we had the first Bush and the first Gulf War, and then we had a lull with Clinton, and then we had the terrorist attacks of 9/11. But I don't think the United States can really shrink from any sort of position of leadership internationally if we're going to continually fight a global war on terrorism.
You mentioned an interesting term, just to go with our viewers, the Vietnam hangover.
Yeah.
Which has nothing to do with those hangover movies, right?
No, no. The idea is that, the Vietnam War had the draft back then, and there was a lot of opposition to the war. Although, interestingly, not until the last couple years of the war was there a majority of the United States population that was against the war. But after the Vietnam War, people just did not want to get involved in international affairs anymore. Attitudes towards internationalism, should the United States lead? Should the United States be involved abroad in other nations' affairs, really declined. And it also declined because of Watergate. Richard Nixon and Watergate, trust in government went down during the 1970s, and the whole, as you would say, the zeitgeist for U.S. leadership, for the United States, for people trusting in their leaders to send, to do what's right for the country, to do what will make the country stronger, really dwindled. And that actually, as it got to a nadir, that lifted Reagan into office, right? Because with the energy crises and such in the 1980s.
Also, again, in the 70s, the sort of reaction against the sort of imperial presidency, right? Johnson and Nixon and things.
Yeah, that's the terms that I would use, right? The abuse of power by Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. The president became too strong. Congress even slapped the president's hand with the War Powers Resolution in 1973. And people just wanted to focus on home again. And that gives opportunity, or it reduces opportunity for a president if he doesn't have the public support for whatever types of ambitions he has internationally.
This is a difficult question, but I'm always curious about this. I mean, we always think about what is it that shapes a president's mindset about policies, or in this case, we'll focus on sort of national security, foreign affairs. In one instance is it really depends upon the milieu in which they were raised, their worldview that's formed early on in college or when they get out of college. Another group says that, you know, the president's kind of malleable and it just depends on the advisors. So, you know, when in the George W. Bush days, there was all this, you know, sort of investigation of the Vulcans and the neocons.
Right.
And Bush was sort of a tabula rasa for foreign affairs because he didn't care about it, you know, in 01. And then 9/11 happens and he happens to have these very hawkish advisors and things like that. And so that kind of pushes him one way. Similarly, people have talked about Obama and having, you know, whether it's Susan Rice, or Samantha Power, or some of these people, now John Kerry, you know, have different views than he does. I mean, is it the president's sort of own views of how he sees the United States and the U.S. role in the world? Or is it these advisors around him, you know, kind of shaping policy and influencing him?
Well, sorry to give you the regular political science answer. It's a little bit of both. It really is. Obviously, as you said, President George W. Bush was not particularly intellectually curious about the rest of the world. He only went to Mexico before he became president. And when pressed by some reporters, he could not name the leaders of several really important strategic nations. President Obama, a bit more worldly, had a little bit more of a worldview, but again, not quite as developed as maybe some other presidents had. He was more focused on domestic policy. He really just wanted to clean up America's image abroad and clean up the war in Iraq and actually expand the war in Afghanistan, which is what a lot of his supporters didn't actually realize he wanted to do that, even though he said that.
Right.
And of course, the advisory structure for the president is extremely important. Generally, we think of what are called the big four advisors for the president, and they are the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the CIA Director. And during Bush's term in office, he also included Vice President Dick Cheney into that role. And Dick Cheney played a very big role in terms of determining what information reached the president and also delineating what his options were. And of course, the president also leaned very heavily on Vice President Cheney in terms of encouraging him which direction he should go on which of the alternatives that were presented to him that had already been narrowed down. President Obama has a much bigger national security advisory structure and plays it in much more of an ad hoc way in terms of what the issue is, determines who he's going to bring in as advisors. And there is a lot more of competition among the advisors in terms of who has the best idea. And so it's not quite as much as, say, when John F. Kennedy had his executive committee and Robert Kennedy was being the devil's advocate. It's not quite that type of thing. But there are a lot more people involved in the national security process, which means the president moves a little bit more slowly, which can be perceived as weakness. Inaction is oftentimes perceived as weakness. But it also means that he has more ideas. And we can see this with President Obama's vacillations on Syria early on. That's a really pretty good example of that.
One thing I always find interesting is if you look at post-war, once the National Security Council system gets developed in the post-war period, we see this pattern that emerged that people like Richard Neustadt and others have sort of pointed at, where you tend to have Democratic presidents who like this sort of collegial, competitive sort of management style. JFK being perhaps, you know, one of the paradigmic examples where he just didn't like National Security Council meetings, thought they were a waste of time, and do things with other groups and things. And then you've got Republican presidents. I think the best example probably would be Eisenhower. You know, very structured, hierarchical, you know, sort of 50s wire diagram sort of thing, which Nixon to a lesser degree, and then also Bush Sr. sort of had. Obama seems to be in that same pattern of having this collegial. I mean, why is it that Republicans tend to like one structure and Democrats like the other, do you think?
Well, I think it has to do with a level of authoritarianism within the Republican mindset as to who makes the decision, right? George W. Bush used to call himself the decider, right? And the buck has to stop with someone, although that was Truman's line, right? He was a Democrat. But I think Republicans also like to delegate authority a bit more than Democrats do. I think Democrats like to have things be a little bit more free-flowing and have more ideas going on. I think Democrats like to play with ideas a little bit more. I think Republicans like to stick to a policy. They like to choose it, act quickly, stick to it, and see it through. Less second guessing and such. And we've seen that with, and the delegation can sometimes be a problem, as we've seen with President Reagan and the Iran-Contra scandal, as well as the delegation of authority by Richard Nixon to Henry Kissinger when Nixon was busy with the Watergate affair, and Henry Kissinger really was running foreign policy.
One thing that's interesting, you mentioned Truman and the buck stopping here. One of the other segues I think is funny is that if you ask, particularly in this recent Atlantic interview that Obama gave, when he thinks about his model, he mentions sort of, George Bush Sr. as his model. And then quite famously early on when people were asking Bush about sort of his presidential model or legacy, he picked the Truman model, right? I might not be liked now, but people will come to respect me, 20 or 30 years from now. Is that just purely a PR to reach out to the other party, or is there something kind of interesting about Bush and Obama where they're looking at the other party's presidents for models or legacies?
No, I think they really believe that. I think those are actually true statements. And I do believe that Obama's approach to United States hegemony and leadership in the world is to share the load, right? He wants other nations to be involved. He wants them to be invested, both financially as well as politically. So that they have a stake in the outcome of the elections. For example, the negotiations with Iran, the P5+1 negotiations, involving other nations, sharing the costs, sharing burdens. That's what George H.W. Bush did in the first Gulf War. The coalition that he built to take out Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War in 1991 was based on getting other nations to contribute. Japan particularly contributed a great deal of funding for that effort. In contrast, his son, George W. Bush, when he put his coalition together, instead of collecting money, he was paying out money and political promises to other people, which really made it a very expensive venture. So yes, I do believe that Obama is looking at ways where the U.S. can still lead, but not on its own, to lead a coalition that shares the burden and is invested, using more soft power than hard power, getting people to want the same things that we want rather than forcing our will on others just with our economic and military superiority. And that is a George H.W. Bush model that we call leveraged leadership, which is the subtitle of my book.
Oh, excellent. All right, we're going to take a short break. We're going to talk about more things with Todd Belt after the break, but right now a couple of announcements.
You're watching Think Tech Hawaii, 25 talk shows by 25 dedicated hosts every week, helping us explore and understand the issues and events in and affecting our state. Great content for Hawaii from Think Tech.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage of the Think Tech Hawaii Digital Network. On Center Stage, every Wednesday at 2 p.m., we talk to artists of all different ilk, playwrights, novelists, poets, singers, sculptors, you name it. We've had all kinds of interesting people on, and we always talk about what they do and how they do it. And what I find most interesting, we talk about why they do what they do, the process of art, what it does for us and our humanity. I hope that you will come and join us, and maybe you'll get inspired to bring out your creative spirit as well. That's Center Stage on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock on the Think Tech Hawaii Digital Network.
Hello and welcome back to Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton. We're talking to Dr. Todd Belt of UH Hilo, talking about his book, The American Presidency in a Post-Heroic Age. And we're talking about the nature of the presidency and about foreign policy and some of the decisions and management styles of the presidency. One other kind of puzzle that comes in that I think my students find very odd when I introduce this idea is that from about Kennedy on, and this has kind of gone into hyperdrive, I don't know, since Nixon or so, in addition to having this huge executive branch that presidents manage, the State Department, Defense, all these things, the presidents, as they go along, start contracting sort of inside the White House, and they start replicating all of the different executive branch offices inside the White House, and almost viewing like the State Department or the Defense Department or whatever, or the Department of Justice is like almost like foreign entities, even more foreign than Congress is.
Or enemies.
Or enemies, yes. Which is, it's really funny. Like I say that to students, and they're like, that's weird. I mean, why is that?
It's the nature of the work. The president I mean, you can look at what happens to presidents' hair colors over time, right? I mean, you can look at George W. Bush, 2001 versus 2009, and Barack Obama, 2009. It is a difficult job, and you'll see a lot of people in those departments cycle through, you know. Oftentimes, there's usually a 2-year window when you see people work, and they're not going to stay there for a very, very long period of time. Some people usually as long as 4 years, but usually you don't see people stay in the full 8 years that the president has to stay there. And when you work with somebody, you have to sometimes make decisions and order them to do something that they advocated against. And when you're asking people for a lot of different ideas and for input, and you decide against them, that can rub people the wrong way. And then they're responsible for carrying out your dictates, even though they disagreed with them, and then having to answer questions on your behalf, and carrying the same line because the president's cabinet, obviously, and all of his department heads have to reflect his ideas and explain his decision. And sometimes when it's not your decision, or when you only agreed with it part way, or even worse, if it was your decision and it wasn't fully articulated or funded by the president, or he didn't go as far as you want, that can be a real strain on intergovernmental relations, even within one branch.
Interesting. One of the things as well, I mean, you've got your book up again, the Post-Heroic Presidency, Leverage Leadership in Age of Limits. You mentioned Age of Limits. Are those internal limits? Like, for example, if you go back to sort of George W. Bush and Cheney, I mean, one of the things, you know, Cheney seems to be reacting against is this sort of humbling of the presidency during the Carter years and so on, or what he perceives to be the humbling of the presidency.
And Clinton.
And
Yes.
Clinton as
Yeah.
well. So there seems to be internal limits, War Powers Act, these other things. On the other hand, there are also external limits, right, in terms of whether or not we've moved away from a unipolar age, a rise of multipolarity and things. If you're looking at a president like Obama, do you think that he mostly sees internal limits to the presidency or external limits?
If we're just looking at Obama, probably more internal than external. Presidents have pretty wide latitude on foreign policy when it comes to what they can get done. When it comes to domestic policy, Congress has a lot more authority. However, with President Obama, the Republicans have really lined up against him on just about everything he has wanted. We used to have what was called the water's edge myth, right? The politics stops at the water's edge, that we're all Americans, we all get on board with the president and line up behind him with what he wants to do in terms of foreign policy. And that has not been the case with Obama. A very good example is the Iran nuclear deal, or his policy with Israel, where we've seen a number of members of Congress really move forward without the president to try to almost conduct U.S. foreign policy, taking an end around him. So there are very strong limits in there, but it should be underscored that the major limit to power is one's own national economy, right? And so you cannot project power, you cannot develop a military, you cannot develop the carrots and sticks that you need internationally, not just military, but also foreign aid and assistance, and developing pathways for foreign direct investment by U.S. companies into other nations, which can build rapport and can also stimulate growth in those nations. Those types of things require a healthy economy at home. And the U.S. economy has been more and more dependent upon imports rather than exports. We bring in a lot more than we take out. Now, that's not necessarily bad because, you know, we want some of this stuff, right? We want some cheap stuff from China, right? We want iPads from China. Well, I don't know if iPads are selling anymore. iPhones still are, right? So we do want these things, and you know, it does send our money out. And our federal government does not have a balanced budget amendment, and we cut taxes in the early 2000s. George W. Bush cut taxes in 2001. They were not raised back up except for the very, very highest earners earning over $400,000 midway into Obama's term. And then we fought 2 wars without raising taxes. And you can't do that. And that really weakens the nation abroad. Obama also came into office with the second worst recession we've ever had in U.S. history, right? The worst since the Great Depression, at least. You might be able to argue that some downturns in the 1800s were nearly as bad, but we don't have as good data back then. And so he had to focus on the economy, and the recovery was long and slow, and he didn't get everything he wanted in the stimulus bill, and there were other things he had to take care of domestically. And facing a Republican Congress dead set against him and trying to pass his signature health care, he's found it very, very difficult to lead. But he's also taken sort of the long game approach, where he's tried to get a few things, and his idea is get it now, tweak it later. Right? So we're going to get this one win, and then maybe we can tweak it in the long run. On foreign policy, he had this whole Cuba policy. He'd been negotiating it for years through a backdoor with Pope Francis, right? And so and it wasn't just an overnight thing. And that's one of the things that President Obama bristles about when people ask him, oh, all of a sudden you have Iran, all of a sudden you have Cuba. He's like, no, we've been working on this for years. You know, this didn't come back overnight. But we do know that presidents do tend to focus on foreign policy during their second term rather than their first term. You get elected basically on your domestic policy agenda, not your foreign policy agenda. Although maybe Mr. Trump may have something to say about that. But presidents generally focus in their second term. They don't have to worry about re-election, and they've had it with Congress by then.
Right. One thing, I mentioned the Obama interview in The Atlantic, which I found quite interesting on several levels. I've been using it as a focus group with some of my students this week. One thing I thought was interesting, there's this kind of tension or kind of an interesting puzzle I find with the interview, because when Obama came into office, I think about a lot of different regions that were interested in having him, and it's a change from Bush and so on. He campaigned in Europe and things. He's done a lot of this outreach. But what's interesting, when I do research in Europe, if I do research in India, so the two main places I go, particularly in the foreign policy elites, there's a lot of a sense of sort of exasperation about Obama. That Obama hasn't paid enough attention, and he tends to be very sort of crisis-driven.
Yeah.
And his interview in The Atlantic really reflects that. I mean, a lot of time in Syria, if I think about a lot of the foreign policy decisions he's made that'll probably have a longer legacy, things about the rebalancing to Asia or the Iran deal or this opening of Cuba, very short shrift in his own interview. And I found that different or strange, if you will, that he came to be very, very crisis-focused, very Syria-focused in the interview.
Yeah, well, I think in that interview, he was being very introspective about the types of things he did not get done, right, and what he wishes he had done better. I don't think he was using that as an opportunity to really blow his own trumpet on that issue. The president, just his persona, he is perceived as being aloof. He is a bit detached, very cerebral, very thoughtful, maybe not as engaging as President George W. Bush was in terms of how he dealt with foreign leaders. They could get under his skin quite a bit, quite frankly, and that does bother him. But also, if you look at, when we think of the president, it's important to think that the presidents don't come in with a blank slate. They don't, it's not like a starting pitcher in baseball. It's more like the relief pitcher, right, that comes in. There's already a score on the board, right, and there's already things that have happened. Quite frankly, Obama came in and he inherited, 2 men on base. He inherited two wars, right, and he inherited a dramatic change in the policy towards North Korea under George W. Bush. Bill Clinton, under the agreed framework, had a much different policy that kept North Korean nuclear development at bay during his presidency until George W. Bush got into office. And so he's had to deal with a legacy that's come to him. And presidents are oftentimes like firefighters. They got to put out whatever the fire is, right? The world still looks to America for leadership. They look to the United States for leadership, and the president is our chief executive officer, No time to discuss it in committee, princess, as Han Solo said, right? So it's important for the president to act when there are crises, and when you have a war on terrorism, you have a lot of crises, right? And we have the president trying to launch decapitation strikes through drones against leaders of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, responding to crises abroad. Doesn't leave a whole lot of time for domestic policy, let alone articulating a more coherent foreign policy, such as the pivot to Asia.
One thing that's interesting, I'll go back to Congress in a second here with this, is one thing that's interesting, as you mentioned, is Congress seems to, cast itself in a role sort of resisting President Obama's policies. And on the other hand, though, it doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to have made Congress very popular with the American people, even their own supporters. And I joke with my students, I think a couple of years ago, there was a poll that was done where Congress's approval rating rates lower than I think some sexually transmitted diseases.
Right. Cockroaches.
Right, cockroaches and
Yeah.
things. So even though they've had this strategy of sort of resist, we're campaigning against Obamacare or whatever Obama's doing, it doesn't seem to have translated into popularity for a lot of members of Congress. I mean, is that a paradox? Or?
Well, the paradox is that people hate Congress in general, but they love their congressperson particularly. Those national numbers, of course, are not stratified by the 435 congressional districts in 100 states, or 50 states that we have. So people generally dislike Congress because they don't understand how it works. They do see their congressperson in their district coming back and cutting ribbons and doing things for the district. But when they think of Congress in general, they think it's slow, and they don't understand that it was deliberately designed to be that way. This is supposed to be our deliberative body. It is supposed to move slow. How a bill becomes a law, well, that little Schoolhouse Rock cartoon didn't even scratch the surface, right? I mean, that didn't even get all the way. It is very difficult, and it was deliberately designed to be that way to avoid tyranny of the majority. Congress is a very slow-moving body, and I think people don't understand that it was deliberately designed to be that way.
I mean, there's that analogy or that folk story, right, that goes on between the conversation between Washington and Jefferson about the tea in the saucer, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
That you're supposed to pour the hot tea out in the saucer and it'll get cooler so you can drink it. So deliberative decisions, not
The
fast.
Senate is the saucer that cools the hot cup that is the House. Yeah, but the Senate's been pretty hot itself. I mean, we can look at the nomination of the Supreme Court Justice Merrick Garland and how he is lingering without a hearing. So I'm not saying that Congress is without fault at all. Certainly they have been very, very resistant to this president, and it has been very, very difficult for him to get things done internationally as well as domestically.
For you, I mean, at kind of getting toward the close of the Obama administration, I mean, what do you think will be sort of his legacy, do you think? In terms of foreign policy that you've been dealing with the book. I'll try to narrow it down, otherwise that's too big.
Right. In terms of how the president has dealt with the decline of U.S. power in general, I think Obama's done a pretty good job of retrenching U.S. power without giving up complete leadership. People like Bill Clinton, people saw him as weak and giving up U.S. leadership abroad, but that's not completely true. Obama, like Clinton, has provided leadership in different ways. For Clinton, it was in issues such as international trade, international finance, and finding ways to get things done in those veins. For Obama, it has been security as well as international trade. And he has been providing leadership, climate change as well. He really wants that to be his legacy, is climate change. He wants to leave the world with a plan to lower carbon emissions. And he has provided leadership on that, unfortunately. The Supreme Court case that came down on that has made the U.S. plan less likely. But I think that in the long run, we will probably see that he has found a way to share some of the burdens of empire in ways that his predecessors have not.
Interesting. Well, thank you, Todd. Thank you for coming on and talking about your book, about talking about the post-American presidency, and about a whole bunch of other things too, as well as that I asked you. So please, if you get a chance, it's what I've seen from it so far. I haven't read the whole thing. Quite good, quite worth your time to read. And thank you again for coming.
Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
All right. I'll see you guys all next week on Global Connections.